Today, we journey back to a moment in time that defied every rule of urban evolution, a place where the earth itself was reshaped by the sheer will of the desperate and the bold. Before we begin this exploration of power, ruin, and rebirth, I must share that this narrative has been meticulously crafted using advanced artificial intelligence to bring history to life with unparalleled depth. If you find yourself captivated by these stories of human struggle and triumph, please consider subscribing to the channel to join our growing community of seekers and historians. The story of San Francisco begins in the year 1848 in a quiet, fog-shrouded Mexican pueblo known as Yerba Buena. At that time, it was a modest settlement of perhaps 400 souls, living in simple adobe structures clustered around a small, muddy cove. Life moved at the pace of the tides, governed by the trade of hides and tallow, far removed from the geopolitical shifts of the distant world. The hills were covered in scrub oak and sagebrush, and the air carried only the scent of salt spray and the sound of gulls. It was a place of solitude, a forgotten outpost on the edge of a continent that few cared to map. However, a single event on the American River, hundreds of miles away, would shatter this tranquility forever. When James Marshall looked down into the cold waters of Sutter's Mill and saw the glint of yellow metal, he did more than discover gold. He ignited a psychological wildfire that would draw the world toward that tiny cove. By the year 1849, the name Yerba Buena was erased, replaced by San Francisco, a name that would soon ring in the ears of every dreamer on the planet. The transformation was not gradual, but a violent, sudden eruption of humanity that the world had never witnessed before. By the time the calendar turned to 1851, the quiet pueblo had vanished beneath a tide of timber and canvas. The population had swelled from a few hundred to over 30,000, a number that grew with every ship that dropped anchor. These were not just immigrants, they were Argonauts, men and women who had abandoned their pasts to chase a ghost in the mountains. The city became a pressure cooker of ambition, where the very air seemed to vibrate with the urgency of making a fortune. It was the most extreme urban transformation in American history, a place where a man could wake up a pauper and go to bed a king, or more likely, vice versa. The harbor of San Francisco in 1851 was a sight that defied logic, described by many as a forest of masts. Ships from the United Kingdom, China, Australia, Chile, and the eastern United States converged on the Golden Gate, creating a maritime traffic jam of epic proportions. Once these vessels arrived, however, they often never left. Sailors, infected by the gold fever, would jump overboard and disappear into the mines before the sails were even furled. This left hundreds of grand ships abandoned in the harbor, rotting in the sun, while their captains pleaded for crews that would never return. The city, starving for space and building materials, did not let these skeletons go to waste. In a display of ruthless pragmatism, the abandoned ships were dragged onto the mudflats and integrated into the urban fabric. They were stripped of their rigging, roofed over, and turned into the very infrastructure the city lacked. A whaling ship became a warehouse, a merchant brig became a saloon, and a massive hull became a hotel. This was a city built by the world, using the debris of global commerce to house a population that had no time for traditional construction. This era created a surreal landscape where the line between land and sea was permanently blurred. San Francisco was quite literally a floating city that was in the process of becoming solid ground. To create more room for commerce, the residents began a massive project of land reclamation, filling the cove with sand from the hills and rubbish from the streets. They built wharves that extended deep into the water, and then they built buildings on top of those wharves. Eventually, the space between the wharves was filled in, burying the hulls of those abandoned ships deep beneath the city's foundations. Even today, beneath the modern skyscrapers of the financial district, the remains of the Gold Rush fleet lie silent in the dark earth. These ships, like the Niantic, were the anchors of a new society, providing the stability that the shifting sands could not. The streets were laid out in a grid that ignored the steep topography of the hills, reflecting a stubborn refusal to let nature dictate the city's form. It was a city of wood and canvas, built over a graveyard of ships, a testament to the chaotic energy of 1851. At the heart of this storm was a landscape of pure, unadulterated chaos, where the pursuit of wealth trumped every human comfort. In the early 1850s, the streets were not paved with gold, but with a thick, treacherous mud that could swallow a horse whole. To navigate this wasteland, merchants laid down planks of wood, crates of tobacco, and even sacks of flour to create makeshift sidewalks. The cost of living was astronomical, with a single egg costing more than a day's wages in New York City. Yet, no one complained about the prices because the potential for profit was even greater. This was the crossroads of future financial power, a place where a canvas tent might sit next to a sturdy brick counting house. There was no room for aesthetics, only for utility and the rapid exchange of goods and services. Men lived in overcrowded boarding houses or slept on the floors of saloons, their lives centered entirely on the docks and the markets. The urgency was palpable, as everyone felt that the gold might run out tomorrow and they had to secure their share today. It was a city that never slept, driven by a collective insomnia fueled by coffee, whiskey, and greed. But the very materials that allowed San Francisco to grow so quickly also made it incredibly vulnerable to its greatest enemy, fire. Between the years 1849 and 1851, the city was razed to the ground no fewer than 6 times. These blazes were not mere accidents. They were infernos that consumed entire districts in a matter of hours. The combination of dry timber, canvas walls, and high winds turned the city into a tinderbox. Each time the bells rang out an alarm, the citizens knew that their entire world might be reduced to ash before sunset. The most devastating of these was the Great Fire of May 4th, 1851. It began in a small shop on Portsmouth Square and, driven by a fierce wind, swept through the business district with terrifying speed. By the time it burned itself out, nearly 2,000 buildings had been destroyed, and the heart of the city was a smoking wasteland. The financial losses were estimated in the millions, a staggering sum for that era. It was a moment of profound despair, a test of whether this collection of strangers could truly be called a community. Yet the spirit of San Francisco was defined by its response to these disasters. Even as the embers were still glowing, merchants were seen on the streets negotiating for new lumber and iron. They realized that if the city was to survive, it could no longer be built of flimsy wood and hope. The fire of 1851 forced a transition toward permanence and resilience. The reconstruction began almost immediately, but this time the buildings were different, reflecting a hardened wisdom. The new San Francisco was built with heavy brick walls, thick granite foundations, and massive iron shutters designed to seal out the flames. Prefabricated iron buildings were imported from as far away as New York and London, representing the first wave of fire-resistant architecture in the West. This was the moment the city grew up, accepting the hard truth that its survival depended on engineering rather than luck. Permanence became the only defense against a cycle of destruction that had nearly wiped the city off the map. This shift marked the end of the pioneer camp and the birth of a true metropolis. However, as the city became physically stronger, its social fabric began to tear under the weight of lawlessness. The rapid growth had outpaced the development of any effective government or police force, leaving a power vacuum. This vacuum was filled by gangs, such as the Sydney Ducks, criminals who had migrated from the penal colonies of Australia. They operated with near impunity, engaging in arson, robbery, and insurance fraud. The fires were often rumored to be set by these gangs to facilitate looting in the ensuing chaos, adding a layer of terror to the already precarious lives of the citizens. The corruption was not limited to the streets. It reached into the very heart of the volunteer fire companies and the local government. When the formal legal system proved itself unable or unwilling to protect the merchants, they took the law into their own hands. In the summer of 1851, the first Committee of Vigilance was formed. This was an extrajudicial body of hundreds of prominent citizens who bypassed the courts to impose what they called swift and certain justice. They held secret trials, conducted public hangings, and deported known criminals by force. This movement revealed a darker underside of the San Francisco dream, where the line between order and tyranny was razor-thin. While the vigilantes succeeded in temporarily reducing crime, they also established a precedent for mob rule that would haunt the city for decades. Portsmouth Square, once the site of social gatherings, became a place of execution, where the gallows served as a grim reminder of the cost of stability. The city was a place of extreme contrasts, where the pursuit of a civilized society was often achieved through brutal, uncivilized means. By the mid-1850s, San Francisco had become a city of divided worlds, a mirror of the social hierarchies found in older global capitals. The wealthy elite, enriched by trade and banking, began to migrate toward the heights of Rincon Hill and later Nob Hill. From these vantage points, they could look down upon the chaos of the harbor while breathing cleaner air, far removed from the stench of the waterfront. Their homes were displays of opulence, filled with imported furniture, fine art, and the latest fashions from Paris. This was the beginning of the city's famous stratification, where wealth sought the high ground. In stark contrast, the waterfront descended into a realm of vice known as the Barbary Coast. This district was a labyrinth of dance halls, gambling dens, and brothels, where a man could lose his gold and his life in a single night. It was a place where the laws of the land were ignored in favor of the laws of the jungle. Sailors were regularly drugged and kidnapped, a practice known as Shanghaiing, to fill the crews of outgoing ships. This duality of high society on the hills and raw depravity by the sea became a permanent feature of San Francisco's identity. Amidst this turbulence, distinct immigrant enclaves began to take root, providing a sense of community for those far from home. Chinese immigrants, fleeing famine and war in their homeland, established what would eventually become the oldest and largest Chinatown in North America. They settled in the area around Sacramento and DuPont streets, opening laundries, restaurants, and herbal shops. Despite facing intense hostility and discriminatory laws, the Chinese community built a resilient economic and cultural network that became essential to the city's growth. Similarly, Chilean and Mexican miners formed an enclave known as Little Chile at the base of Telegraph Hill. These communities were the backbone of the city's labor force and provided the international flavor that defined San Francisco as a global hub. They brought with them new languages, religions, and culinary traditions, turning the city into a vibrant mosaic of cultures. However, this diversity was often met with suspicion and violence from the white population, leading to a climate of racial tension that simmered just beneath the surface of daily life. As the gold rush evolved, the city's leaders realized a fundamental truth. The real gold was not in the mountains, but in the pockets of the miners. Commerce became the true engine of San Francisco's lasting success. Entrepreneurs like Sam Brannan, who famously announced the discovery of gold to the city, made millions not by digging, but by selling shovels, boots, and blankets. He understood that in a gold rush, the one who controls the supplies is the one who truly wins. This mercenary spirit transformed the city into the commercial and financial capital of the American West. The waterfront was the beating heart of this economy, a place where goods from across the globe were traded with a ferocity that rivaled any stock exchange. Ships from Asia brought silk and tea, while vessels from South America carried beef and flour. The city's foundries and factories began to manufacture the heavy machinery needed for deep vein mining, signaling a transition from a service economy to an industrial one. Banks like Wells Fargo and the Bank of California were established to manage the massive flow of bullion, cementing San Francisco's role as the treasurer of the Pacific. Information became as valuable as any physical commodity during this period. On top of Telegraph Hill, a massive semaphore system was erected to signal the arrival of ships coming through the Golden Gate. When the wooden arms of the semaphore moved, the entire city would watch, knowing that a new shipment of goods or a bundle of letters from home was minutes away. Merchants would race to the docks to be the first to buy up cargo, understanding that in a market this volatile, a few minutes could mean the difference between a fortune and a bankruptcy. This obsession with speed and information was the precursor to the technological ambition that would later define the region. The city was not just building buildings, it was building systems of communication and trade that connected the frontier to the global economy. By the late 1850s, the first telegraph lines were being strung across the mountains, and newspapers like the Daily Alta California were providing daily updates on global events. San Francisco was no longer an isolated outpost, it was a node in a worldwide web of commerce. Despite its reputation for lawlessness and greed, San Francisco also possessed a desperate hunger for culture and refinement. The same men who spent their days in the mud of the marketplace spent their evenings at the theater or the opera. The Jenny Lind Theater and the American Theater were grand structures that hosted world-class performers, offering a temporary escape from the harsh realities of frontier life.
It's humbling, isn't it?
Architecture began to reflect this aspiration, with Gothic and Italianate styles appearing in the homes of the merchant class, signaling that the city intended to be more than just a temporary camp. Churches and libraries were established alongside the saloons as the citizens sought to build a moral and intellectual foundation for their new home. Art and music flourished, supported by a population that had the wealth to patronize the finer things in life. This pursuit of beauty amidst the chaos was a crucial part of the city's emerging identity. It was a place that embraced its contradictions, where a man might attend a high society ball one night and witness a street brawl the next. This cultural complexity gave San Francisco a depth that other Western cities lacked. By the decade of the 1860s and the 1870s, the transformation was complete. The once tiny pueblo of Yerba Buena had been replaced by a sprawling, sophisticated metropolis. The cove was entirely filled in, the streets were widened and paved, and the first cable cars began to climb the steep hills, a marvel of 19th-century engineering. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 further solidified the city's dominance, linking the Pacific coast to the Atlantic and ensuring a steady flow of people and capital. San Francisco had become the beating heart of the California dream, a place where the impossible seemed achievable through sheer grit and ambition. It was a city that had been tested by fire, crime, and economic upheaval, and had emerged stronger each time. The images captured in the lithographs and photographs of the era show a city in relentless motion, a forest of brick and stone where once there had been only sand and sea. It was the premier city of the American West, a global port that commanded the respect of the world. As we look back on the San Francisco of 1851, we see more than just a historical event. We see a masterclass in human resilience and the power of transformation. The lesson we can draw from this chaotic history is that permanence is not something that is given. It is something that is built through trial and error. Just as the city replaced its wooden shacks with brick and iron to survive the fire, we too must build our lives on foundations of strength and foresight. The world will always bring unexpected storms, but it is our response to those storms that defines our character and our future. I hope this journey through the mud and the gold of old San Francisco has inspired you to look at your own challenges with a new perspective. History is not just a collection of dates. It is a blueprint for how we can navigate our own lives with courage and wisdom. May you find the strength to turn your own coves into cities and your own shipwrecks into foundations. I wish you and your family great health, prosperity, and the clarity to see the gold in every struggle you face. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this narrative, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the stories that shaped our world. Until next time.